sorry about the delay, and welcome to our intimate and dimly lit environment this evening. Liberation itself isn't such a difficult concept. The idea of women's liberation has become much trickier as more and more women have tried to exercise greater sensitivity to the particular demands and aims within vastly differing cultures. The gaps have at times seemed insoluble, and the difficulties in trying to find a common ground wherein we might express international solidarity and formulate political tactics for liberation are well known to us all. We all know that a thorough analysis of those differences would divide us here tonight. The feminist goals of these women do differ, and those differences must be respected. What binds us together is the recognition of the need for women's liberation, that there is something, many things, which try to prevent us and others from living our lives in pursuit of fulfilling the potential we know is there. And it is the articulation by women writers of the need for that struggle that we celebrate this evening. In fact, I imagine that all of us can remember how we were introduced to feminism or to political work, in the sense that it would be somebody saying to you, hey, have you read? You haven't? Well, I think you'd better. Because they are women's voices, they communicate enough shared experience for me to hold on to what is thoroughly familiar and try to see through to what is absolutely foreign to my experience. And by such means we learn, because these voices are my teachers.
I have written it, from inside. I have given it the feeling that I have had all the years I've died, that I could document something about black women. And dealing with black women, you can't just touch them in isolation. You've got to touch and say this is happening to them.
In fact, I started writing very early, but fiction about women and men. But when I started to tackle women problems in a non-fiction way, and my first book was called Woman and Sex, this started to create problems. And the problem is not just because I brought up this sexual problem. The problem was the linkage between the political, the economic, the historical, and the sexual.
I enjoy writing. It hasn't always been that way, because for many years I was involved in the battle for black rights in Australia. I have written about the Australian slave trade in historical novels because it was not included in the school curriculum. People cannot afford not to be involved in politics.
If I thought for one moment that there was any conflict between what I do as a writer and what I do as a community organizer, I would have to take a serious look at the writing because perhaps some things that matter. That is to say, they come out of the same impulse to engage in an honorable and consistent way as possible, to engage in the development of my community, that community that names me.
Basically, one must be very true to oneself to be able to write politically. That is to say, if I do not know what is going on in myself, I can never tell people or ask them to act in a certain way or be mobilized. So I learned from my own creative writing for myself, more or less, from my own drawer, from my own desk, that the things that I wished to aim for in a political struggle had to be first clear with myself, that I have to change myself before I go about trying to change other people. And it's a constant process. It's a constant process of staying credible.
There is a school of thought that argues that oppression is the paramount reality, and that the purpose then of the novel is to protest, to analyze that society, those arrangements, those dynamics, those contradictions that characterize the war. And those kinds of works are built on what I would call a very shaky premise, namely that the group you're addressing, which is that class that oppresses you, has a capacity to transform. I think that is rather bogus. It produces, though, a very interesting body of work, a very crucial body of work, because it's the writer as anatomist, the writer as analyst, and that's important. There's another school of thought, however, that argues that the paramount reality is not oppression, the paramount reality is community. That ideologies come and go, analyses come and go, but the ongoing, eternal principles of raising children, of establishing potent relationships, of asking the question and keeping vibrant the vision of what is human society for, that's eternal. So there's a body of work in existence, and I think it's especially being kept alive by current black women writers, that I would call cultural maintenance novels, or novels addressed to the community. And the purpose is, and it's certainly true of my work, the purpose is to celebrate those aspects of our community that have kept us keeping on, and that can move us into the 21st century as sane, whole, governing people. And to critique those aspects in our community that are reactionary, that are unhealthy, that constitute collaboration in one form or another, and to produce discourses that enable people, that enable us.
Black women in South Africa have always been in the forefront of the struggle. I know at the turn of the century, when this legislation was introduced, black women, like black men, were expected to carry passes. Passes are a system whereby influx control is implemented in South Africa to curb the people's movement into places that the government feels the people shouldn't get into. And when all the black people were expected to carry passes, the women resisted this. And they paid heavily for it because many of them were arrested and kept in jails under very hard conditions. And some of the women stuck there, and they felt that there was no point in giving in to carrying passes. And they managed to delay that for 40 years until around about 1953, when the nationalist government came back and introduced that. And well, I suppose you can fight to a certain extent and somewhere you get beaten. But I think one looks upon it as a very courageous and heroic act by the women who managed to do that at that time of in the history of the country. My family had this farm for over 100 years. And with the stroke of a pen, it was declared a black spot. I had grown up in the family, on that farm, and it had always been surrounded by the other white people who had farms in that area. And we had lived, we didn't have to go there, and we didn't go to their homes, they didn't come to our homes. But I was very much aware, even at the time when the farm got into my hands. I used to write to Mr. Fenlin or whoever to say, look, when you have finished threshing your wheat, or when you have finished with, do direct the people this side if they have nowhere to go to come and thresh. And this was a very healthy relationship which had no connotations of anybody patronizing, but we were just human beings who respected one another. And for some reason or other, it was seen as a black spot. You know, you suddenly want to feel that you are made as if, you know, that little land on which you are, because you are black, it is blacker than the other land that is surrounding it. In a way, you've contaminated it. But the moment you are off from that land, I suppose it is cleared of contamination.
Now, in Australia, many of the communities, of course, as you know, were completely wiped out, and the indigenous people lost many of their values because of the destruction. Not only the destruction of the people, but the destruction of the land. And they became, as it were, a landless people. Now, a people without a land are a lost people. We have opposition from, as far as the black people are concerned, tremendous opposition from the mining companies because they want to get in and mine the uranium. And most of the Aboriginal people whose areas are now being claimed as theirs are opposing this. For something like 18 years we battled, and the whole idea, of course, was to place the responsibility for the Indigenous people of Australia in the hands of the Commonwealth government, rather than let it rest in various state governments. That was a long, hard battle, but finally we succeeded. And what happened was that Commonwealth resources were used for health, for legal aid, for education, for housing, and for many other areas of great need among the Aboriginal people. They then took the battle into their own hands, and that's where it is today.
We began to realize that we'd received a mandate from that sector
that had just come through part one of the civil rights movement, and which began, of course, in 1954, which is considered the 60s somehow, and were ready to launch part two, which was the Black liberation struggle that moved through 1972, which is also part of the 60s. Three, that mandate or that task, that bit of homework that we were assigned, was to develop the cultural wing of that political movement that had been launched by such people as Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Martin Luther King, and the Honorable Minister Malcolm X of the Nation of Islam. Well, for the past 3 years, I've been engaged in the writing of a novel based on the response in my hometown in Atlanta, Georgia, to the so-called missing and murdered children's case, which has a number of very striking parallels to the New Cross massacre that occurred here in January '81. Mm-hmm. I say so-called because the name itself, the Atlanta Missing and Murdered Children's Case, the exclusive attention given to the children, only some of the children, masks what the entire case was about, which was the slaughter of a number of men, women, and children in the Black community. And that focus on the children is simply one of the many lies, distortions, and deliberate, as well as arbitrary, misinformation tactics that comprise the official version. Mm-hmm. What the novel pivots on is a simple truth, namely that when people buy into the official version of events, they become committed to the politics of aversion. You immediately begin to deny your own ability to observe and to listen, to gather information, to interpret. You begin to reject your own ability to think, and your own responsibility, I think, too, to be aggressive about getting information and for understanding what one needs to do to effectively change a situation.
Party and its international friends in the peace movement will never accept the deployment of Pershing II and cruise missiles in Germany. Hoping to also go to Moscow and to try to convince both Mr. Reagan and Mr. Andropov that their ways are wrong, and to try to convince our own German government, responsible for the decision of the deployment, that also they are wrong. I'm still fighting for hope, though I do admit that as years go by in the struggle and as the world seems to get larger and larger with the problems, one in fact has a very hard time to communicate with a language, with words. And so I find probably the only way of communicating is through actions, is through trying to do nonviolence in a very direct way. In fact, a very few days ago, on Tuesday it was, I had been to Alice Springs and then went on to the gates of Pine Gap, where the women of Australia last year made their first Greenham Common in Australia. And I asked that Greenham Commons be created all over Australia, because Australia is tied, as was rightly said, to a first strike strategy and will in fact be connected to the so-called nuclear holocaust. And standing at Pine Gap with a group of members of the peace movement of Alice Springs in the middle of the desert at a gate on a Sunday afternoon, I began realizing that it's the same all over the world, regardless where you're standing, that you're standing in front of barbed wire and there are friendly policemen smiling at you thinking you're quite ridiculous, bringing books of Gandhi and flowers to their gate. But we tried it with a message of Gandhi and with a message of Dorothy Day and with a message of Martin Luther King, but I don't think they understood that message. And so we went away again realizing that there must be, and this is a tribute to all the women at Greenham Common, there must be Greenham Commons all over the world.
think that the Iranian revolution was aborted because it started political, social, and economic. Right. But then it was aborted to become religious, and Islamic fanatic groups took over. And women were sacrificed, in fact. But these are many powers playing. It's internal powers and external powers. Mm-hmm. And I think that many international capitalist powers, they prefer an Islamic revolution in Iran or in any other country than a socialist revolution. Well, I think that the question should be, can women be liberated under a capitalist society or a socialist society rather than a Christian society or a Muslim society? Because you can have women be liberated in a Christian society. Because when you separate between state and religion, as happened here in the West, you had this industrial revolution which separated between state and religion was weakened and the state was strong. So what religion can be marginalized when you have a socialist system or when you have a capitalist system. So I think that women can be liberated under any religion, Islam or Christianity or Judaism, so long you separate between religion and state, and so long you have a system that's fighting against patriarchy and class.
We were for 480, but now we are for freedom.
But the problem is how to link oppression in the family, sexual oppression, with political and economic oppression. Maybe you don't have this in the West here, but in countries like Egypt and in many countries, the so-called third world countries, you cannot separate between women issues and national issues and national aspiration for complete independence. And especially, now colonialism has different shapes. It's not the traditional old colonialism. We have the new colonialism and imperialism, capitalism. And in order to have our resources, full resources for ourselves, then we have to be liberated, especially economically. And that's why women issues are put in that global sense.
The point I'd like to make here is, and perhaps this is also common in other countries, we worked for 10 years to force the federal government of Australia to hold a referendum to abolish state laws and make the government responsible for the Indigenous people. And they were a hard 10 years. Now, the people who worked around the clocks were essentially the women, only a handful. But they worked during the day and during the night and 7 days a week, answering the phone and going to meetings and lobbying the parliamentarians in the federal government. And it's some distance, of course, to go to Canberra. You can easily go down here to Westminster. That's not a great problem. But if you want to go and get hold of your Prime Minister in Australia, you've got some hundreds and hundreds of miles to travel. And then, of course, on top of that is a considerable expense. So it's not easy to carry out lobbying effectively if you're a poor organization. But this was done essentially by the women. There were some very good men, very few, but very good and very consistent. But the round-the-clock work was mainly done by the women. Now, when we succeeded in achieving our goals, wherein we forced that government to hold that referendum, a ministry was formed, and the ministry became the Ministry for Aboriginal Affairs. And so jobs became available. Now, what happened was that the men immediately began to carve a career out of it for themselves. And it's still going on, but it wasn't so with the women.
And women are victims, and that's why I believe that women in Iran or in any country should have their own political power as a prophylactic measure, because usually, even also in the Algerian Revolution, women were killed and they participate in the revolution. And then after the revolution, they tell them, go back home. But the only guarantee and the only prophylactic measure for women to keep their rights after revolution is by having political power.
So there is a great need for the black women of Australia to unite, to work more consistently, to recognize their power also, because if only women realize they are a great threat to men, you know, one of the things they should do, we ought to set our goals about emptying the parliaments of all that stuff they have there and rearranging them so that women will go in. Sure, there are women who are like men in the governments, but I'm talking about the women who care, the women who want to know that this earth is going to continue to exist, that we will, if we unite, and if we get rid of warmongers, that we will at least prevent a nuclear war. And the women that we need for this kind of thing have got to be strong women. And they have to have the backup. They have to answer to the rank and file, and consistently. And so we haven't got this in Australia. Sure, in the last few years, we've had more women go into the federal parliament representing various electorates, and they are good women. But it's not enough, and it's my belief that until women withdraw their support from the men who call for arms, we really haven't achieved what we ought to be achieving.
History tells us that every oppressed class gained true liberation from its masters through its own efforts. It is necessary that women learn that lesson, that she realize that her freedom will reach as far as her power to achieve her freedom. It is therefore far more important for her to begin with her inner regeneration, to cut loose from the weight of prejudices, traditions, and customs.
By organizing separately as women with certain strategy, progressive one, political one, economic and social and sexual, and to have their own political power as a party, as a group, not just to organize socially, like women organizations.
And I think what is essential is that groups have the courage to meet separately and to begin to fashion an agenda of self-interest before they begin dialoguing. Now, why is that? Because in a society where there is uneven power, political and economic, there's also uneven power in terms of discourse. Well, there's uneven power in terms of cultural effectiveness. So that when two people begin to talk to each other and they come from two different classes, to use that word with heavy quotes around it, that dialogue, they're not meeting as peers. They have behind them a baggage of history. And they may think they're discussing as peers, as equals, but it's bogus, and I think it's a faulty notion. I think groups need to, as I say, meet separately until such time as they have fashioned their own self-interested agenda, until such time as they have defined what their relationship will be to other communities, and can then establish in a principled way what will be the terms for coalitions with other groups. In the United States, of course, black women are and have been for centuries involved in anti-imperialist movements, anti-war, lately anti-nuke. It's not new. And as I say, many choose to work in groups that are multicultural or multiracial, and many groups prefer to work in homogenous groups with only black women. And I think all those impulses are legitimate and important, so long as there is some kind of open lines of communications.
Usually in international conferences, Western women come to us and say, how can we help you, women of the third world?
Yeah.
So usually I answer, well, you can help us by fighting against your own political system in your own country, not by coming to our country and helping us, which is also significant. But the main thing is that we are all, as women, oppressed by the same political system. It's the class patriarchal system, either capitalism or feudalism. And women in the West should fight against their political system, against capitalism.
I would expect that the women in the West would have to tear themselves apart in sympathy with the black women of South Africa, and perhaps rejecting some of the ties some of their families have with South Africa. I can see this as a very complex situation where a lot of working out a way whereby perhaps you would have to do your homework here at home.
I think that equal exchange, that we come together, women from different countries come together in international conferences as happening now. And so we exchange our experience on equal grounds. Usually I stress equal grounds, because usually our experience that Western women were also patronizing and trying to dominate women from other countries and to tell them that they know better than even about our own problems that they teach us. And this helped nobody. But in order to really to have equal exchange, to inspire each other, you inspire me, I inspire you, and then also to support each other. And really, when I was in jail under Sadat, quite a lot of Western women movement supported me in writings and demonstrations, and this is one type of international solidarity. So there are many things really we can gain from each other.
And I do believe that many of us, many women all over the world, have to learn to get our own house in order, because that way we will also get the house of those incompetent men in power in order. For I think that far too long, far too many men have been let alone, have been going ahead, doing all the damage, all the nuclear racing, all the arms build-up, all the annihilation equipment, while women have been trying to liberate themselves and prepare for the small war that is led against them every single day, whether they are raped or beaten or whether their children are molested. But I think that we have to learn to connect the small war against us and the big war against us. I think that they are interconnected and that we have to learn to fight subversively and non-violently against both. Thank you.
I have great faith in the power of the people, and I have great faith in the power of, particularly in the power of women.